The morning Dorothy Hale arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, she did it with a smirk. She rode up in a hired buggy dressed in silk the color of new money, and she leaned out the window and looked Evelyn Hartwell up and down. All of Evelyn, from her worn traveling boots to the practical cut of her dress. And she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not even a cruel one that tried to hide itself. It was the laugh of a woman who had decided, before she ever climbed down from that buggy, that what she was looking at wasn't worth the effort of contempt. "So this is Caleb's bride," Dorothy said to the man seated beside her. Her husband, Franklin Hale, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and knew it every minute of every day. "I thought the Whitmore boy had better sense than to import his problems from back east." Franklin said nothing. He just looked at Evelyn with the flat, appraising eyes of a man pricing livestock at auction. Evelyn stood in the yard of a ranch she'd never seen before, in a territory she'd only read about in letters, beside a man she'd married 4 days ago in a courtroom that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. She had traveled 11 days by train to get here. She had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Her trunk had arrived damaged, one corner crushed, and 2 of her books were ruined. She was 29 years old, she was a stranger in every sense of the word, and Dorothy Hale was laughing at her in front of the entire yard crew. If you were standing in her boots that morning, what would you have done? This is the story of Evelyn Hartwell Whitmore, a woman nobody wanted, a woman nobody believed in, and the woman who built something so enduring out of the wreckage of other people's contempt that even now, decades later, her name is spoken differently than other names, with a kind of quiet weight, like something that was tested and did not break. Don't go anywhere. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now and turn on your notifications, because the stories we tell here are the kind that stay with you. Hit the like button if you believe in people who refuse to be counted out. And drop a comment with your city and country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Evelyn Hartwell had not planned to be a rancher's wife. She had planned, in the way that practical women plan when their options are narrowing like a corridor, to find useful work. She had a good head for numbers. She had read everything she could find about agriculture, land management, soil composition, water systems. Back in Ohio, she had kept books for a grain merchant for 3 years and had, in her spare hours, filled 2 notebooks with observations about crop rotation and market timing that the merchant himself never bothered to read. She was not beautiful in the way the word got used in those years, the way it meant small and ornamental and easy to overlook, like a brooch on a shelf. She was solid. She took up space honestly. She had a face that was more interesting than pretty, with dark eyes that moved quickly and a mouth that didn't smile unless something actually warranted it. Men in Ohio had not known what to make of her. Women in Ohio had been kinder, mostly, though kindness in that particular county had a way of carrying a faint note of pity underneath it, like a note played slightly flat. When her father died and left debts instead of savings, Evelyn had written to a correspondence agency. Not out of desperation exactly, but out of the same calculation she applied to everything else. This was the most efficient path available to her, given what she had, given what she needed, given how the world was arranged. She had not expected to feel anything about it. She had corresponded with Caleb Whitmore for 6 weeks. His letters were short, functional. He described the ranch in square footage and head count rather than landscape. He did not mention beauty or romance or love, which she respected. He mentioned that his father had died 2 years prior, that the operation was running at a loss, that he needed someone capable of managing the domestic side of a working ranch so he could focus on the cattle. He was 34. He was not unkind in the letters, but he wasn't warm either. He was transactional, and she met him there, and they agreed. She had understood, boarding that train in Columbus, that she was traveling toward a practical arrangement between 2 people who needed something from each other. She had told herself that was enough. She had believed herself mostly. What she had not prepared for was the look on Caleb Whitmore's face when he met her at the station in Billings. He had seen her come off the train. She watched him see her, watched the specific adjustment that moved across his features in the 3 seconds before he rearranged them into something more neutral. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't cruelty. It was something smaller, and in some ways worse. The quiet recalibration of a man lowering his expectations to match a reality he hadn't fully anticipated. He shook her hand. He said, "Miss Hartwell, good trip?" She said, "Long." He said, "Yes." That was the entirety of their conversation until they were in the wagon and an hour out of Billings. She did not cry about it. She looked out at the land instead, the enormous, rolling, indifferent land, grass the color of dried wheat, sky so wide it seemed slightly unreal. And she thought, all right, this is what it is. Now figure out what you're going to do with it. They were married at the county courthouse 2 days after her arrival. The judge had a cold and kept blowing his nose between sentences. There were no flowers. Caleb had brought 2 of his ranch hands as witnesses, and they stood with their hats in their hands and looked at the floor. Evelyn wore her second-best dress because her best one had been in the damaged corner of the trunk. Afterward, Caleb shook her hand again. She nearly laughed. She didn't, but it cost her something not to. The drive back to the Whitmore Ranch that afternoon was 45 minutes across open country. And in those 45 minutes, Caleb told her 3 things. The cook had quit the previous month and hadn't been replaced. The ranch hands ate in the main house and expected a meal twice a day. And the domestic accounts were in the back office, and she was welcome to look through them. He said, welcome to, the way you'd say, obligated to. She filed this away. The ranch itself, when she first saw it, made her quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with being impressed. It was not a ruined place. It had bones, strong ones. The main house was solid construction, 2 stories, with a covered porch that ran the full front length. The outbuildings were well placed. The fence lines she could see from the road looked maintained. But there was a particular kind of tiredness over everything, the specific exhaustion of a place that had been held together by will for too long without any new thinking to support it. She noticed, pulling into the yard, that the water trough nearest the barn was cracked along one side. She noticed the feed storage was positioned badly relative to the barn entrance. Inefficient, meaning extra labor every day. She noticed the pasture gate closest to the main road was hanging on one hinge and had been wired shut rather than repaired. She didn't say any of this. She was 4 days married to a man who had not yet looked at her without some variant of that recalibration expression. She understood the economy of when to speak. The ranch hands were introduced to her in the yard. There were 7 of them. Most of them were polite in the performative way men are polite to women in situations where they're not sure what the woman's actual authority is going to be. One of them, a wiry older man named Cutter, who had worked the Whitmore land for 11 years, looked at her with something that wasn't quite assessment and wasn't quite welcome, but sat somewhere between them, like a question he hadn't decided whether to ask. Dorothy Hale arrived the following morning. She had apparently heard about the new wife immediately. News traveled fast in country where diversion was scarce, and she had decided to come see for herself. This was how Evelyn learned in her second full day on the property that there was a social hierarchy to frontier ranching that operated with the precision and cruelty of any other hierarchy she'd ever encountered. The Hales owned 4,000 acres. The Whitmore Ranch was 400 and some change. Franklin Hale had lent money to Caleb's father years before, against land, and the terms of that debt had never been entirely resolved. Dorothy Hale had grown up in this county and had decided at some early point in her life that her primary occupation would be maintaining the exact order of things as she understood them to exist. Women like Evelyn, in Dorothy's taxonomy, did not belong at the front of anything. "I wanted to welcome you," Dorothy said from the yard, though she had not gotten out of the buggy, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about the nature of this welcome. "It must be so difficult coming all this way, not knowing anyone, not knowing the land." She paused. "Not having any experience with how things work out here." Evelyn looked at her. She had both hands folded in front of her, and her expression was entirely neutral. "It's kind of you to stop by," she said. Dorothy smiled the smile of a woman who had expected more reaction than this. "We'll have to have you to supper sometime," she said, meaning sometime that would never be scheduled. "Once you've had a chance to settle in, get your bearings." Another pause. "It can take a long time for some people." Caleb was standing 6 feet to Evelyn's left. He said nothing. She registered this, the precise quality of his silence, what it cost him and what it didn't, and filed it. "I'll look forward to that," Evelyn said. Dorothy's buggy left the yard, and Cutter, who had been watching from the shadow of the barn doorway, turned and went back inside without a word. Caleb said, "Don't take Dorothy personally. She's like that with everyone." She's not like that with everyone, Chislon, Evelyn said. She's like that with me. He looked at her, and for the first time since Billings, there was something in his face that wasn't the recalibration expression. She wasn't sure what it was. She didn't have enough data yet. She went inside to find the domestic accounts. They were in the back office, as he'd said, a desk drawer stuffed with receipts, ledger pages, invoices in no particular order, some of them dating back 4 years. Evelyn sat down with them after the noon meal, after she'd figured out where the kitchen kept its flour and made a passable bread that she knew was passable, and the hands knew was passable, and nobody said anything about either way. She spread the papers out on the desk and began reading. 2 hours later, she had a picture that was clearer than she'd wanted. The ranch was not hemorrhaging money in the dramatic way of a bad gamble or a crooked deal. It was bleeding slowly, the way things bleed when no one has adjusted for a changing world. Caleb was running the same headcount his father had run a decade ago with the same grazing rotation, selling to the same buyer network at the same price points, while the market had shifted under him. Feed costs were up. Cattle prices at the regional level had dropped because the buyer pool was narrowing. The big operations were absorbing the contracts, and small ranches like this one were getting squeezed to margins that couldn't sustain the overhead. She could see exactly where the money was going. She could see with equal clarity where it didn't have to. She sat with this for a while. She thought about what she wanted to do with it and what was wise to do with it, and how those two things were not always the same, and how the distance between them was something she'd have to navigate carefully. She heard Caleb come in from the yard at dusk. She heard him stop in the doorway of the office. "Find anything useful?" he said. The tone was careful, not hostile, not inviting either. "I found the accounts," she said. "And?" She looked up at him. He was standing with one shoulder against the doorframe, still in his work coat, hat in hand. He looked tired in the structural way. Not the tiredness of a single long day, but the tiredness of too many long days stacked on top of each other until they'd become a kind of permanent condition. "I have some questions," she said. "When you have time." He looked at her for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow's fine." He nodded. He left. She turned back to the ledgers and worked until the lamp oil ran low, making notes in the margin of a fresh piece of paper in her small, even handwriting. Outside, the Montana night came down fast and absolute, the way it did in open country, like a door closing. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had never found self-pity useful and saw no reason to start now. What she felt, sitting alone in the office of a ranch that wasn't yet hers in any real sense, was something more like steadiness, the particular steadiness of a person who has looked at a difficult situation clearly and has decided to stay. She had married this ranch as much as she had married the man. She had understood that before she arrived, and the ranch, whatever else it was not beyond saving. That was enough to go on. The question she'd planned to ask Caleb the next morning didn't come in the form she'd intended, because at breakfast, one of the hands, a young man named Pete, barely 20, who'd been on the property less than a year, knocked over a full pot of coffee reaching for the biscuits, and then stood there looking at the spreading dark stain on the kitchen floor, with the particular paralysis of someone who couldn't decide whether to be more embarrassed about the accident or the way he'd frozen after it. Evelyn had the mop out before anyone else had registered the whole scope of what had happened. "Sit down, Pete," she said, not unkindly. "Eat your breakfast. It's just coffee." Cutter, across the table, watched her mop the floor without any readable expression. Caleb watched from the end of the table with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. She put the mop back. She refilled the pot from the spare she'd started as backup, because she'd noticed the first morning that one pot was never enough for 7 men, and she put it on the table and sat down. "I wanted to talk about the grazing rotation," she said to Caleb, as if they were already mid-conversation. The table went very quiet. Caleb set his coffee cup down. "What about it?" "You're running the south pasture on the same cycle it was on 5 years ago. The grass density out there is different now. I could see it from the road. You're going to have a problem by late summer if the rotation doesn't shift." He looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. "You can see grass density from a wagon road. I can see when grass is thinner than it should be for the season, yes." She kept her voice level. "I've read a fair amount about pasture management. I'd like to walk the property this week, if that's all right. You want to walk the property? Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Around the table, the hands were all very interested in their plates. After the morning work, Caleb said finally, Cutter can take you. Cutter looked up from his food. His expression suggested this was not a development he'd anticipated. Thank you, Evelyn said. She ate her breakfast. She was aware, without looking directly at any of them, of the specific quality of silence that was doing work around that table. Men recalibrating, adjusting, trying to figure out what exactly they were dealing with and what the appropriate response to it was. She had been in that silence before. Different rooms, different contexts. She knew what it meant and she knew what to do inside it, which was to hold her ground quietly and let people catch up at their own speed. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that the silence in that kitchen was one of the small hinges the whole story was going to turn on. That the word Cutter would say to Pete that evening, out by the fence line, was going to matter more than either of them understood. That Caleb watching her from the end of that table, trying to solve what she was the beginning of something neither of them would have chosen and both of them would come to need. She cleared the plates. She washed the cups. She went to find her boots. The land was waiting, and she had questions for it. Cutter was not a man who gave opinions easily. He had worked the Whitmore land since before Caleb's father died, and in that time he had seen 2 foremen come and go, one bad winter that took 40 head, a range fire that burned through the eastern pasture and left the grass black for 6 months, and enough poor decisions made by men who thought confidence was the same thing as knowledge that he had developed a comprehensive skepticism about people who talked more than they observed. He was 51 years old. He had a bad knee from a fall off a horse 12 years prior that he had never had properly set, and it ached in cold weather, which in Montana meant it ached for approximately 9 months of the year. He did not complain about this. He did not complain about much. He walked the property with Evelyn that first Tuesday afternoon because Caleb had told him to, and he did what Caleb told him with the reliability of a man who understood that the ranch's survival was connected to his own, even if he didn't always agree with the man giving the orders. He had not formed an opinion about Evelyn Hartwell, Evelyn Whitmore now, technically, beyond the basic assessment that she was not what any of them had expected, and that the gap between expectations and reality was something that could go in several different directions depending on the person. He showed her the south pasture first, because that was where they'd started the morning's work, and it was the most logical place to begin. He walked slightly ahead, the way he always walked, with the efficient ground-covering stride of a man who had crossed a lot of difficult terrain and stopped noticing it. He expected her to fall behind. She didn't. She was not graceful on uneven ground. Nobody was, really, who hadn't grown up on it. But she was deliberate, and she corrected her footing without losing momentum, and she kept up. She also didn't talk for the first 20 minutes, which surprised him. Instead, she looked. She looked at the grass, at the soil at the edges of the worn cattle paths, at the fence lines, and the way the land sloped toward the creek. She crouched down at one point and pressed her fingers into the ground and looked at what came up on them, and Cutter stopped and watched her do this without saying anything. How long has this section been running at current head count? She asked, still looking at the ground. 3 years, he said. About? And before that? About the same, maybe a few head fewer. She stood up and looked out across the pasture. The grass was adequate to a casual eye. It was green, it was there, the cattle were grazing without apparent difficulty. But she had spent a week reading everything she could find about high-altitude grassland management before she'd gotten on that train in Columbus. And what she was looking at was not as adequate as it appeared. The root systems were stressed. You could see it if you knew what grass looked like when it was genuinely healthy versus when it was holding on. It needs rest, she said. Cutter said nothing. Not all of it, maybe a third. Rotate it out for 60 days while the other sections carry the load. That'd put pressure on the north section. The north section can handle it. The water access is better up there. The cattle will adapt. She paused. Has anyone talked about moving the secondary grazing east, down toward the creek bend? Cutter looked at her sideways. That section's uneven. Cattle don't like the footing. Cattle don't like it because they're not used to it. 4 weeks on that ground and they'd adjust. And the grass down there is some of the best on the property. It's not being used at all. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the creek bend in the distance and thought about what she'd said with the slow, methodical honesty of a man who knew the land well enough to check a statement against his own experience. The creek bend grass was good. He'd noticed that for years. Nobody had ever done anything about it because the route to get there required opening 2 additional gates, and the cattle resisted the slope the first few times, and it had always seemed easier to leave it. He said. That was all. But she heard something in it. They walked for another 2 hours. She asked questions that were specific and practical. How often the wells were checked, what the feed supplement routine was in winter, where the property line ran relative to the hail fence to the north. She did not ask questions that were rhetorical or that had answers she already knew embedded in them, which was the kind of questioning that Cutter found most irritating in people who were trying to prove something. She seemed to be genuinely accumulating information, and the information she was accumulating was not general. On the walk back, as the light was starting to go amber and long, she said, "Who manages the buyer relationships?" "Caleb," Cutter said. "Same buyers his father used. Henderson and Billings, couple of smaller operations." Henderson's contract. Do you know the per-head terms? Cutter did know, roughly. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. That's below regional average by about 18%. Has been for a while. Henderson's reliable. Reliable isn't the same as fair. Cutter stopped walking. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that morning's breakfast, with the specific attention he normally reserved for things he needed to make a decision about. She was looking back at him without any particular urgency, just steady, the way she'd been all afternoon. "You going to tell Caleb that?" he said. "When the time is right," she said. He started walking again. "He won't like it." "I know." Henderson's an old family connection. Caleb's father set that relationship up. "I understand that." "So you know it's not just about the numbers to him." "Yes," she said. "That's why the timing matters." Cutter chewed on this for the rest of the walk back. He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did she. And when they got back to the yard, he went to see about the evening feeding, and she went inside to the office, and he told himself he didn't have an opinion about her yet, and tried to believe it. He mostly failed. The first real fight between Evelyn and Caleb happened on a Thursday, 11 days after her arrival. It wasn't the fight she'd been expecting, which was about the Henderson contract or the grazing rotation, or any of the practical adjustments she'd been making carefully and incrementally since that first walkthrough with Cutter. It was about something smaller, which is how the real fights usually started. Pete had come to her 2 days earlier with a problem. He was the youngest of the hands, 20 years old, with a younger sister back in Nebraska, whose letters he received and read in the evenings by the bunkhouse door. He was a decent worker who made mistakes not from carelessness, but from inexperience, and he had, over the past 2 weeks, shifted from being vaguely uncomfortable in Evelyn's presence to being somewhat openly relieved by it. She didn't know why exactly. She suspected it was simply that she talked to him like a person rather than an inconvenience. His problem was that the secondary water pump on the east fence had been seizing intermittently for 3 weeks. He'd reported it to Caleb twice. Nothing had been done about it. He'd mentioned it to the senior hand, a man named Ruiz, who had shrugged and said the pump was old and probably needed replacing and that Caleb knew about it. Evelyn went and looked at the pump herself. It didn't need replacing. It needed a specific repair to the valve housing, a repair that required a part available from the hardware supplier in town that would cost approximately $4, and that Pete could perform himself with a basic demonstration. She had identified this by reading the manual she'd found in the bottom of the equipment shed, which was the same manual that had presumably always been there and that no one had apparently consulted in several years. She had ordered the part. She had done it using the household account, which was technically within her authority, and she had thought it was a small enough decision not to require Caleb's sign-off. It was not small enough. Caleb found the receipt on the office desk Thursday morning and came to find her in the kitchen. He was not shouting. He wasn't a man who shouted, but his voice had a tight, compressed quality that was in some ways harder to deal with than shouting. "You ordered parts on the ranch account without telling me." Evelyn turned from the stove. "For the east pump. It's been seizing for 3 weeks." "I know about the pump." Then you know it needs a $4 valve repair. What I know, Caleb said, is that this is my ranch and my accounts, and you don't make decisions about what gets spent without coming to me first. She looked at him. She had a wooden spoon in her hand, and she set it down on the counter with a deliberate care that was its own kind of statement. It's $4, Caleb. That's not the point. What is the point? The point is that you don't run this operation. You manage the house. That's what we agreed. Something moved through her expression. Not anger exactly, more like the process of deciding whether to let something go or to name it, and landing on the side of naming it. We agreed, she said, that I would manage the domestic side of the ranch. A water pump that waters 3 pastures is not domestic, it's operational. It's been broken for 3 weeks. Pete told you twice. Nobody fixed it. Pete should have come to me again. Pete did come to you, and then it stayed broken. She picked up the spoon again. I fixed it. It cost $4. If that's a problem, take it out of the household budget. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. His jaw was doing something, working slightly, the way it did when he was holding something back. Then he turned and left without another word. She listened to his boots on the porch. She stared at the pot on the stove and breathed slowly and told herself this was not a defeat. It was also not a victory. It was just the shape of the territory, and she had known the territory was going to be rough before she set foot in it. What she hadn't known was how much it would cost to hold her ground in it. Not strategically. She'd planned for that. But somewhere in her chest, where she'd packed away the part of herself that had wanted something different from this arrangement and told it to be quiet. Ruiz was in the yard when she came out an hour later. He was 43, solid and quiet, from somewhere in New Mexico originally. He had been on the property for 6 years and was the most technically skilled of the hands, the one Caleb relied on for the complicated work. He had not warmed to Evelyn and had not been cold to her. He occupied a careful middle position that she understood to be its own form of intelligence. "East pump's running clean," he said as she passed. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. "Good," she said. "Pete did all right on the repair." "He did. He's a quick learner." Ruiz turned and looked at her then, briefly, the way you looked at something you were recalibrating. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to what he was doing. She filed this away, too. The Henderson conversation happened 3 weeks later, and it went worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to go badly. She had spent those 3 weeks building a case with numbers. Not arguments, not positions, numbers. She had pulled together the regional cattle price data she'd had the general store order in from Billings in the form of 2 months' worth of market bulletins. She had written out a comparison of what the Whitmore operation was receiving per head versus what comparable operations of similar size and quality were receiving from buyers who operated outside the old established networks. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a ranch that was slowly dying and one that could sustain itself. She put the pages on the office desk on a Sunday evening when Caleb was going over his own end-of-month figures, and she sat across from him and waited. He looked at the pages. He looked at them for longer than she'd expected, which meant he was engaging with them rather than dismissing them, and that was something. "Where'd you get these numbers?" he said. "Market bulletins, public information, you can verify every figure." He turned a page. "Henderson's been with this family for 20 years. "I know. I'm not saying end the relationship. I'm saying renegotiate the terms or supplement it with at least one additional buyer relationship, so you're not dependent on a single contract. Henderson's reliable. 18% below market isn't reliable. It's comfortable. Those aren't the same thing." She paused. "Your father set up that contract in different conditions. The market's changed. The terms haven't." Caleb looked up from the pages. "My father built this ranch." "I know he did." She kept her voice even. "And then the market changed, and the terms didn't change with it, and now the ranch is where it is." He stared at her. She could see the thing she'd named landing in him, and she could see him resisting it, and she could see the resistance was partly pride and partly grief, and partly the genuine difficulty of being told that something your father built had a flaw that was costing you. She understood all of that. She did not think understanding it obligated her to unsay the truth. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded. She took that for what it was. Not agreement, but not a door slamming either. And she left him with the pages. It was a further 2 weeks before he said anything else about it, and what he said was, "I'm going to Billings next week to talk to Henderson." She was washing dishes when he said it. She didn't turn around. "All right. I'm not promising anything. I know." He stood in the kitchen for a moment. "You should probably write down what you think the terms ought to look like." She turned then. He was already walking out. She wrote down what she thought the terms ought to look like. It took her 2 hours because she was precise, and when she handed the pages to Caleb the morning he left for Billings, he folded them and put them in his coat pocket without looking at them in front of her, which she had expected, and which was fine. He came back from Billings with a renegotiated contract. Henderson had pushed back. Caleb had held the line, her line, the number she'd written down, and Henderson had moved. Not all the way, but 12% of the way, which was not everything, but was not nothing. It moved the ranch from one kind of danger to a slightly less immediate one. Caleb told her this in the office the evening he got back. He said it the way you said something you were giving credit for, but hadn't entirely decided how you felt about giving. 12%, he said. "That's good," she said. Henderson wasn't happy. "No, I imagine not." He asked who'd done the market research. She waited. "I said I had," Caleb said. There was something in his face when he said it. Not satisfaction, not quite. More like discomfort with something he'd done that he wasn't sure was the right call. She looked at him. "That's fine," she said. He met her eyes for a moment. "It shouldn't be." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. He knew what it meant, and so did she, and the acknowledgement was real even if it was incomplete, and she was practical enough to understand that real and incomplete was sometimes the best available. The breeding program idea came to her in the 4th week, from a combination of 3 things. A conversation with Cutter about which cattle were pulling their weight and which weren't. An article in an agricultural journal she'd gotten from the library in town about bloodline improvement programs being tested in operations in Wyoming and Colorado, and a cold morning when she'd walked the main pasture and watched the herd with the detached attention of someone doing inventory rather than admiring. The Whitmore herd was serviceable. It was not exceptional. The cattle were a mixed lot, acquired over years without a consistent strategy, and the result was a herd that performed adequately across the board and exceptionally nowhere. In a market where the squeeze was coming from above and below simultaneously, big operations driving prices down, small operations getting cut out of premium buyer networks, adequate wasn't going to be enough. She talked to Cutter first. She'd learned over these weeks that Cutter was the person whose technical knowledge was deepest, and that he was more receptive to ideas when they came to him as questions rather than proposals. So she asked him which animals in the herd he'd consider the strongest performers, and which he'd cut if he could, and what he thought the genetic quality of the existing stock was relative to what was available. Cutter was quiet for a long time after she'd finished talking. "You're talking about culling about 30 head, he said, 25 to 30, the bottom performers, and reinvesting in 2 or 3 quality bulls from operations with documented bloodlines. That's a significant expense up front." "Yes." "And it doesn't pay off for at least 2 years, could be 3. "Yes." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of taking something seriously. Caleb's not going to like that math. Caleb's going to like it less when the herd is still producing at the same level in 5 years. Cutter said nothing. He turned and looked at the pasture. The cattle were moving slowly in the afternoon heat, unhurried and without direction, doing what cattle did. "There's an operation up near Great Falls," he said, eventually, as if he were talking to himself. "Landry. He's been running a cross-breeding program for 6 years. People talk about his bulls." Evelyn filed this away. "Would you be willing to talk to him?" "I can ask around." "That's all I'm asking." He nodded. They stood there for another moment in the specific, comfortable silence of 2 people who had arrived, without much ceremony, at a functional working understanding. She brought the breeding program proposal to Caleb on a Friday evening. She had waited for Friday deliberately, because she had observed that Caleb was slightly less compressed on Friday evenings. The week's accumulated pressure had found some release in the week's completed work, and he was capable of a kind of measured hearing that he wasn't always capable of on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, which were his most difficult days for reasons she hadn't fully decoded yet. She laid the proposal out in the same way she'd laid out the Henderson analysis. Numbers, projections, sourced information, comparable operations. She had gotten a letter back from the Landry operation near Great Falls, through Cutter, with information about their bull program that was more detailed and more encouraging than she'd expected. Caleb read through everything. He was quiet for a long time. "We don't have the savings to cover this and maintain operating costs," he said. "I know. I've looked at 3 options for bridging the gap." She turned to the last page she'd prepared, which she'd spent 2 days on. "The first is selling the bottom 25 head now, which recovers enough to fund the bull acquisition. The second is a short-term note against the property, which I'd recommend against. You've got existing debt exposure and adding to it is risky. The third is a deferred payment arrangement with Landry, which Cutter thinks is worth asking about." Caleb looked up. "You've already been talking to Landry?" Cutter has, informally. His expression did the thing again, the complicated thing that was several things at once. "You went around me." "I went to Cutter, who went to Landry, as a preliminary inquiry. Nothing was committed." She kept her voice level. "I didn't think you'd want to go directly to Landry without some sense of whether he was open to conversation." He stared at the papers. She let him stare. "This is a significant risk," he said. "Doing nothing is also a risk. It's just a slower one." He pushed back from the desk and stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard, which was dark except for the lamp over the barn door. She waited. She had learned that Caleb's silences were not empty. They were full of things he was working through, and interrupting them didn't help. "My father would say this is reckless," he said. "Maybe. What would you say?" He turned and looked at her. It was the longest he'd held her gaze since Billings. Something in the quality of it had changed. She couldn't have said exactly when the shift had happened or how large it was, but it was there. "I'd say I need to sleep on it," he said. "All right." He slept on it for 4 days, which she had not quite expected. On the 4th day, he came to her in the kitchen before breakfast, when it was just the 2 of them and the smell of coffee and the early light coming through the east window, and he said, "If we do this and it goes wrong, we could lose the ranch." "Yes," she said. "That's true." "You understand that?" "I do." "And you still think it's the right call?" She looked at him steadily. "I think doing nothing is a certain kind of loss, and doing this is an uncertain one, and I'd rather bet on a possibility than wait out a certainty." He was quiet. Outside, the first sounds of the hands stirring in the bunkhouse. "All right," he said. She poured his coffee. He took it. Neither of them said anything else because they were both the kind of people who understood that some decisions didn't require ceremonies. They just required doing. The sale of the 25 culled head happened over 2 weeks in October. It was not without difficulty. 3 of the hands, including Ruiz, thought it was a mistake and said so directly to Caleb, and Caleb, to his credit, told them the decision had been made and would stand. And Evelyn heard about this second hand from Pete and stored it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. The first bull arrived from Landry in November. He was a 4-year-old with a documented bloodline that Cutter examined with an attention so focused it bordered on reverent. He stood in the yard and looked at the animal for a full 3 minutes without speaking. "Well?" Evelyn asked. "He'll do," Cutter said. Coming from Cutter, that was a standing ovation. The ranch hands gathered around with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Pete asked 3 questions about the bloodline documentation that were surprisingly good questions, and Evelyn answered them, and Ruiz, standing at the edge of the group, listened to the answers without asking any of his own, which was not the same as not registering them. Dorothy Hale appeared the following week. She had heard about the sale of the 25 head through the usual channels of frontier gossip, and she had arrived at her own interpretation of what it meant. And she arrived at the Whitmore Ranch with that interpretation already formed and her conclusion already drawn, and she delivered it in the yard in front of Cutter, Pete, and 2 other hands who happened to be nearby. "I heard you sold off a quarter of your herd," Dorothy said to Caleb, though she was looking at Evelyn. "The whole county's talking about it. They're saying—" She paused, with the precision of someone who had chosen their timing carefully. Well, they're saying your wife has gotten you into a situation you're going to have trouble getting out of. Caleb opened his mouth. Evelyn spoke first. Her voice was easy, without tension, like she was discussing weather. What they're saying and what's true are often different things, Dorothy. I expect you know that better than most. Dorothy's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. Of course, I'd hate to see what your father-in-law built come to nothing, Caleb. Then I imagine you'll be relieved when it doesn't, Evelyn said. She turned and went inside, not quickly, not with any theatrical quality, just steadily, the way she always moved. Behind her, she heard Cutter make a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been something else entirely. Caleb came inside 20 minutes later. He found her at the desk going over feed cost projections. He stood in the doorway. You didn't have to do that, he said. She was going to say it anyway. Better to cut it short. He was quiet for a moment. She'll be worse next time. Probably. Evelyn turned a page. She can be as bad as she likes. It doesn't change the numbers. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh. He wasn't a man who laughed easily, but something in the vicinity of it. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. She kept working. He stayed in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, and then he went out to the yard, and she filed that too. That small moment added it to the collection of moments that were building towards something neither of them had named yet, and both of them could feel taking shape in the spaces between everything they said. The winter settled hard and early that year, the way Montana winters did. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the cold had been waiting just past the ridge and finally lost patience. The ranch contracted inward. The days got shorter and heavier. The work didn't diminish. It changed texture, became a different kind of hard. Evelyn found herself falling into the rhythm of it. The 4 a.m. mornings, the cold kitchen where she had to relight the stove before anything else could happen, the specific exhaustion at the end of a day that had been entirely physical in ways she'd never experienced before. Her hands changed. She noticed this one evening looking at them in the lamplight. They were rougher, more capable looking than they'd been in Ohio. She wasn't sure what she felt about this. Something between pride and a kind of mourning for the woman she'd been when her hands looked different, and she acknowledged both feelings and moved on because there was always something that needed doing. And in the long dark evenings when the wind pressed against the windows and the house settled into its own breathing, she and Caleb began by degrees so small they were almost invisible, to talk. Not about the ranch, always. Sometimes about other things. Small things, observations about the hands, a book she'd finished, something one of them had seen from the window. The conversations were not smooth. They had the halting quality of two people who had been cautious with each other for a long time, beginning to test different ground. He was not easy to talk to. He was guarded in ways she suspected he wasn't even fully aware of, the guardedness of a man who had been the only person responsible for something important for too long and hadn't ever fully put that weight down. But he listened. She had noticed this early, actually. He was a listener. He didn't interrupt. He considered what you'd said before he responded, and when he responded, it was usually with something that indicated he'd actually heard you, which was rarer in people than it should have been. One evening in January, he came inside from a long, cold day and sat down at the kitchen table while she was finishing the accounts, and said, without preamble, "My father didn't think I could run this place." She looked up. He didn't say it directly. He didn't say much directly, but I knew. He looked at his hands on the table. He left the operation to me because I was the only one left to leave it to, not because he thought I'd make it work. She set down her pencil. "And have you? Made it work?" He looked up at her. "Jury's still out." "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded. Something about him had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that you could point to and name, but the air between them had changed slightly, the way air changed in a room when someone opened a window that had been closed a long time. She picked up her pencil again. He got up and poured himself coffee and stood at the window looking at the dark yard, and neither of them said anything else, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. Outside, the wind moved across the open land the way it always had, indifferent to the people inside the small warm house that had been handed down through trouble and stubbornness, and that now held, in its various rooms, the particular unfinished work of two people who were still in the process of figuring out what they were to each other and what they might, with sufficient patience, become. The spring that followed that winter was the best the Whitmore Ranch had seen in 4 years. Not dramatic best, not the kind of best that announced itself. It was the quiet best of things that had been adjusted correctly beginning to show their results. The grass in the south pasture came in thicker than it had in recent memory because it had been rested through the fall. The Creek Bend section, which Evelyn had pushed to open up the previous autumn, was carrying cattle that had adapted to the footing exactly as she'd predicted and were grazing on grass that Cutter had privately admitted was the finest on the property. The new bull from Landry had settled into the herd with a confidence that the older animals had gradually accepted, the way herds always eventually accepted a dominant animal, through a combination of posturing and time. Cutter noticed all of this. He noticed it the way he noticed most things, without ceremony, without announcement, simply by filing the observations against his accumulated knowledge of the land, and concluding that the numbers were moving in a direction they hadn't moved in a while. He didn't say this to Evelyn directly. He said it to Ruiz one evening by the corral fence, in the oblique way that men who don't easily give compliments give them, by stating a fact that implied a conclusion without stating the conclusion. South pasture is looking different, he said. Ruiz had looked at the pasture and said nothing, but the next morning he'd asked Pete to check the water levels in the Creek Bend section without being told to, which was its own kind of acknowledgement of the direction things were going. Evelyn knew the spring results were encouraging. She also knew they were early. 2 good months didn't make a program, they made a beginning. The real test of the breeding program was 18 months away at minimum, and between now and then there was still the matter of the operation's underlying financial fragility, which the renegotiated Henderson contract had improved without fixing. She kept the accounts with the same precision she'd applied since the first week, and what the accounts said was that the ranch was stable. In a way it hadn't been, but stable was not the same as secure. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in late April when the Garrett boy rode in with the county bulletin, which he delivered to the larger properties along his route twice monthly. He was 15, bony, with a horse that was too big for him, that he rode anyway with the casual fearlessness of someone who hadn't yet accumulated enough experience to know what horses could do to you. She took the bulletin from him, gave him a piece of bread from the morning batch, and stood on the porch reading while he turned his horse around. The bulletin was mostly routine: road conditions, land registry notices, a notice about a livestock auction in Billings in June. But there was a paragraph near the back, in the small, dense type reserved for legal and financial notices, that made her stop. She read it twice. Then she went inside to find Caleb. He was in the barn with Ruiz going over the condition of the equipment that needed to come out of winter storage. She stood in the barn doorway and waited until there was a natural pause. "Franklin Hale has filed a water rights claim on the Northern Creek tributary," she said. Caleb turned from the equipment. "What?" She held out the bulletin. He crossed the barn and took it, and read the paragraph she'd indicated. His face, as he read, went through several changes: surprise, then a focused stillness that she'd learned was his version of alarm being contained. "That tributary feeds our north well," he said. "Yes. And the Creek Bend section, and the secondary pasture water supply." He looked up from the bulletin. "He can't. That water's been shared use since before my father's time." "Shared use is not the same as documented rights," she said. "If he's filed a formal claim, he's starting the process of making it his exclusively." Ruiz had come to stand nearby, listening. His expression was difficult to read, but he wasn't pretending not to hear. "Why now?" Caleb said. Evelyn had been thinking about this since the porch. "Because now is when it would hurt us most. We've opened up the Creek Bend section. We've shifted grazing load to the north. Our water dependency on that tributary is higher than it was 6 months ago." She paused. Someone who'd been watching the operation would know that. Caleb was quiet. He handed the bulletin back to her. Something in the set of his jaw had changed. "I need to go to town," he said. "I know, but before you do, we need to talk to someone who knows the land registry history. Do you know who filed the original property deeds when your father bought this land?" Old Mercer handled most of it. He's retired, but he's still in Billings. Can you get to him this week? I can go today. She nodded. Find out whether there's any documentation on the historical water usage. Agreements, surveys, anything that predates the Hale claim. If the shared use was ever in writing, we have something to work with. If it wasn't, she stopped. If it wasn't, Caleb said, then we need to understand what we're dealing with before we decide what to do. He left within the hour. She watched him ride out with the particular feeling of someone who has just seen a problem arrive that they knew was coming in some form, but not in this one, on this day, at this specific moment when the ranch was still consolidating the ground it had only recently gained. She went back to the office and spent the rest of the morning doing something she'd done before on other problems. She started reading. The County Land Registry Procedures. Water rights law as it existed in Montana Territory at that time. What constituted prior use, how it was established, what documentation could support or undermine a claim. She was not a lawyer and had never pretended to be, but she had found that most situations that looked like they required a lawyer at the front end actually required careful reading first, because lawyers were more useful when you understood what you were asking them. By afternoon, she had a clearer picture, and it was not an entirely comfortable one. Franklin Hale's claim was procedurally valid in its filing. The tributary in question had never been formally documented as shared use. It had operated that way because the Whitmores and the properties upstream had all drawn from it without conflict, which was common across the frontier where water was plentiful enough that formal division seemed unnecessary. But plentiful enough had its limits, and water rights law was moving in a direction across the territory that was making informal arrangements vulnerable to exactly this kind of formalized claim by whoever moved first. Hale had moved first. What Evelyn found in her afternoon of reading was that prior use could still be established through evidence, not documents necessarily, but records of the kind that existed without people thinking of them as legal evidence. Receipts for well work that referenced the water source. Accounts that showed when the north well was dug and what it drew from. Any correspondence that mentioned the creek arrangement, the kind of paper trail that accumulated around a working ranch without anyone intending it to be a legal record. She went through the office files with a focused attention that the files had never previously received. Caleb's records were not organized in any way that would have been recognizable to someone trained in filing, but they were all there because he was not a man who threw things away. She found receipts going back 9 years. She found a survey notation from a land assessor who'd visited in connection with a fence line dispute 8 years ago that referenced the tributary explicitly as serving both the Whitmore North pasture and properties to the east. She found a letter from a neighboring rancher named Aldous Birch, written 7 years ago, that mentioned drawing water from the same source and thanking the elder Whitmore for his agreement to share the intake during a dry August. She set these aside in a separate pile. By the time Caleb returned from Billings that evening, she had 4 documents that she thought were worth something, and a 5th that she thought might be worth a great deal, depending on how a judge read it. He came in looking tired and slightly grim. Old Mercer, he said, had confirmed what she'd suspected. Nothing formal had ever been recorded about the water arrangement, but Mercer had also said something that Caleb reported with the careful tone of a man quoting something he wasn't sure how to weigh. He said Hale's been in Billings 3 times in the past 4 months, meeting with the land attorney. Evelyn looked up. This wasn't improvised. No. She pushed the pile of documents toward him. Sit down. I want to show you something. He sat. He went through the pages one by one. The survey notation made him stop. He read it twice, the way she'd read the bulletin that morning. This references the tributary specifically, he said. Yes. And it predates any formal claim by years. It's not a legal agreement, but it establishes usage pattern. Would a judge care about that? I don't know. That's a question for a lawyer. She paused. But a lawyer will care about it more than they'd care about nothing, which is what we had this morning. He set the pages down. He looked at her. That look that had been evolving since January, since the evening he'd told her about his father, that was still not fully formed but had moved further towards something she could read. How long did this take you? He said. This afternoon. He nodded slowly. There's something else, he said. I talked to 2 people in town. Hale's not just going after the water rights. He's got a note against this land. You know about that. Your father's debt. Yes. He's been quietly buying up the other notes around the county, the Birch operation, the Dunmore place to the south, 3 other small ranches. Caleb's voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. He's positioning to call them all in at once. If he controls the water and calls the notes simultaneously, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He can force the sales, Evelyn said, and buy at distressed prices, and end up with everything from the Hale northern boundary to the county line. The room was very quiet. Outside, the evening birds were doing what they always did, indifferent to the particular human crisis happening 40 feet below them. How long does he have before the water claim goes through? She asked. 60 days for contest period. And the notes? He can call ours any time. The balance is $600. She turned this over in her mind. $600 was not an impossible sum, but it was not a sum they had liquid. The breeding program had committed most of their available cash. The Henderson adjustment had improved income, but not at a pace that produced large reserves. Is there anyone else in that 60-day window who would contest the water claim? She asked. Caleb thought. Birch draws from the same tributary. So does Emmett Fraley to the east. Birch sent your father that letter I found. He has documentation too, probably, if he knew to look for it. She was thinking out loud now, not performing thought, but actually working through it, which was a distinction people who knew her could tell. If multiple parties contest simultaneously, the claim gets complicated. Hale's attorney would be fighting on several fronts at once instead of one. You think we should go to Birch and Fraley? I think we should go to everyone affected and tell them what's happening before Hale tells them his version. She met his eyes. How many ranches did you say he's got notes on? 5, including ours. Then there are 5 families who don't know yet that they're being managed. And if they find out from us, with documentation, before Hale moves, they have choices. If they find out when he calls the notes, they don't. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You're talking about organizing them. I'm talking about giving them information and letting them decide what to do with it. That's not the same as organizing them. Although, she paused, if they decided to act together, the outcome would be different than if each of them acted alone. He pushed back from the desk and stood and went to the window, the same window he'd stood at in winter looking out at the dark yard. The yard was lit now by the late spring dusk, longer evenings, the particular golden persistence of light at this latitude. My father would have gone to Hale directly, he said, man to man. And Hale would have been polite and reasonable, and nothing would have changed. A pause. Probably. Franklin Hale is not making a mistake, she said. He's executing a plan he's been developing for months. The only thing that disrupts a plan like that is something he didn't plan for. Caleb turned from the window. He didn't plan for you. She held his gaze. No, I don't think he did. He was quiet for another moment, and then, I'll ride to Birch tomorrow morning. I'll go with you. He looked at her. She could see him calculating the social complexity of it, the way it would read to Aldous Birch and the other ranchers. A woman coming along to talk business. She could see him deciding. All right, he said. Aldous Birch was 63 years old and had been ranching this county since before most of the current generation had been born. He was a large man, gone somewhat to softness in the middle, with a white beard he kept neatly trimmed and the patient eyes of someone who had weathered enough seasons that knew trouble arrived differently than it once had. Not as a shock, but as an unwelcome confirmation of the way things tended to go. He listened to Caleb's account of the water claim without interrupting. He accepted the copy of the survey notation and Evelyn's notes on the relevant statutes and read them with care. When Caleb was done talking, Birch sat with his hands folded on his kitchen table and looked out his window for a while. I knew Hale was up to something, he said. Couldn't have told you what. But a man doesn't meet with land attorneys that many times for no reason. He looked at Evelyn. You put this together. Most of it, she said. Caleb had told me his wife came from Ohio. That's right. Birch looked at her with the assessment of a man who had learned to read people over decades of necessary dealings with them. You got any legal training? No, I read. He almost smiled. Hale's going to call my note, he said. I expect you know that. We think so, yes. Yours and 4 others. How much time before the water claim is settled? 60 days for the contest period. If multiple parties contest, it could extend beyond that while the challenges are heard. And the note? He can call it any time, but calling it while a water rights dispute is active would create complications for him. The land value is tied to the water access, and if the water access is under legal question, the collateral valuation gets murky. Birch looked at her steadily. You worked that out yourself. This morning. He unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table. What do you need from me? Documentation of your water usage from that tributary, anything that predates Hale's claim, and your participation in a joint contest filing, if you're willing. I'm willing, he said it without hesitation. Who else are you going to? Fraley, the Dunmore family, the Prentice operation, if they're affected. Prentice draws from a different source, but Dunmore's tied to that tributary same as us. He paused. Margaret Dunmore's alone out there since her husband passed in February. Hale knows that. I imagine that's part of the timing. Evelyn filed this. We'll go to her next. They left Birch's property an hour later with his documentation in hand and his agreement to send his son to the county seat to file a contest notice within the week. Caleb was quiet on the ride east toward the Dunmore place, not the compressed silence of conflict, but something more reflective. You knew about Margaret Dunmore, he said eventually. Not specifically, but someone whose husband died recently with a note outstanding. Yes, that's who you go after first if you're Franklin Hale. You think like he does. I think about what a person's plan requires, she said. You don't have to be like someone to understand their logic. He considered this. You're not angry at him. Of course I'm angry at him, but anger's not useful right now. They rode in silence for a while. The land opened up ahead of them. The wide, uncomplicated distance of the eastern reach, grass and sky, and the occasional stand of trees near a water source. I misjudged you, Caleb said. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without decoration, without build-up. Just the statement, sitting in the open air between them. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead. You did, she said. I know it. We can talk about that another time, when this is handled. He nodded. They rode on. Margaret Dunmore was 57 and had the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who had always done more than half the work and was now doing all of it and knew exactly what that meant. She received them in her yard with a guarded courtesy that opened slightly when Evelyn laid out what they'd found. As Evelyn talked, Margaret's expression shifted through several things. Alarm, then fury, then the focused calm of someone converting emotion into intention. He sent a man out here last week, Margaret said, asking about the note. Said it was routine, just checking in. She said the last 3 words with a precise contempt. I told him the note was in good standing. It is, Evelyn said, but that doesn't prevent him from calling it if he chooses. What do I need to do? Evelyn told her. Margaret listened with complete attention, asked 2 questions that were exactly the right questions, and by the time they left her property, she had committed to the contest filing and had produced, from her own records, a bill of sale from 11 years ago that referenced the tributary water source explicitly and was signed by Franklin Hale's own father as a witness. Caleb looked at that document for a long moment before giving it back to Margaret. His father witnessed it, he said. His father was a different kind of man, Margaret said simply. The next 2 weeks moved at a pace that was difficult to describe to someone who hadn't been inside it. Evelyn and Caleb visited 4 properties in 5 days. They found Emmett Fraley already suspicious and almost immediately cooperative. The younger Prentice son, who managed his family's operation since his parents had aged out of the heavy work, was frightened at first and then, when he understood the collective nature of what was being proposed, steadied. There was a rancher named Cavell, who was skeptical and resistant for 3 days before Birch rode out to talk to him personally, because Cavell trusted Birch in a way he wasn't yet willing to trust Caleb, and hadn't formed any view of Evelyn at all. Cutter ran the Whitmore operation during this period with a competence that required no instruction. Pete, who had by now developed a loyalty to Evelyn that was the slightly awkward but entirely genuine loyalty of a young person who has encountered someone who took them seriously for the first time, kept the domestic accounts updated without being asked. Ruiz said nothing about any of it and did his work and watched. The contest filing went in on a Thursday, signed by 6 properties, more than anyone had expected when the week began. The county clerk, a precise woman named Agnes Holt, who had processed enough land registry actions to know what 6 simultaneous contest signatures meant, looked at the stack of documents and then looked at Caleb and then looked at Evelyn, who was standing slightly behind Caleb, and said, "This is well organized." "Thank you," Evelyn said. Agnes Holt stamped the filing. "Hale's attorney is going to be busy," she said, and went back to her desk. The drought arrived in June. It came the way Montana droughts came, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small absences. The rains that should have come in May had been lighter than expected. The June rains didn't come at all. The grass that had come in thick and promising in April began to lose its color by the 3rd week of June, and by the 1st week of July, the south pasture was showing the stressed pale tan of ground that was giving more than it was receiving. Evelyn had seen it coming for 3 weeks before it was obvious to anyone else. She had been watching the soil moisture, measuring the creek level at the tributary twice weekly, tracking the feed supply against projected need. She had started adjusting rations in early June before anyone on the property thought it was necessary, and this had produced the first genuine friction with Caleb since the water rights situation had realigned their working relationship. "We're not in a drought," he said when she raised the ration adjustment. "Not yet, but the indicators, the grass is dry. That happens in summer." The creek level dropped 4 inches in 3 weeks. That doesn't happen from summer heat alone. He looked at her. "You've been measuring the creek." "Since April. I should have started earlier, but I didn't know to." She pushed her notebook toward him. "The trend line is clear." He looked at the notebook. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he was reading it carefully, and not just performing the gesture of reading it. "If we reduce rations and the drought doesn't materialize," he said, "we stress the herd unnecessarily. If we don't reduce them and the drought does materialize, we run out of feed before fall and we're buying emergency supply at 3 times the price, assuming we can get it." He was quiet. "I'm not asking to cut deep," she said. 10% now. We reassess in 2 weeks." He nodded, not enthusiastically, but he nodded. 2 weeks later, the creek was down another 6 inches, and the sky had not produced a meaningful cloud in 18 days, and the south pasture was visibly suffering. Caleb told her to cut the rations another 10% without being asked. The full weight of the drought landed in August. By then it was not a local condition but a regional catastrophe. The Billings papers were running accounts of losses across 4 counties. The railroad was reporting disrupted cattle shipments because ranchers were selling desperate, and the stockyards were overwhelmed. The Fraley operation, which had less water access than most, lost 40 head in a single week when their primary well went inadequate, and they couldn't get feed supply moved fast enough from Billings. The Hale operation, 4,000 acres, with its own diversified water sources and deep reserve capital, should have been weathering it adequately. What Evelyn had understood from her reading of water rights law and property records was that the tributary Hale had filed to claim exclusively was in fact the water source that 3 of the smaller ranches they'd brought into the contest filing depended on, and that those ranches losing that water to Hale's exclusive control during a drought would have been a death sentence. The contest filing had prevented that. It had frozen the water rights question in legal uncertainty, which meant the shared use arrangement continued under the prior use presumption while the challenge was pending. Hale's attorney had argued for a temporary injunction to enforce the claim during the contest period, and the county judge had denied it on the grounds that the existing usage patterns were well documented and disrupting them pending resolution would cause irreparable harm to multiple parties. Margaret Dunmore still had her water. Emmett Fraley still had his. The Whitmore Creek Bend section, with its superior grass and Evelyn's carefully managed stocking rate, was the healthiest grazing land in that part of the county. The first rancher to come asking was Cavell, the one who'd been skeptical, the one Birch had needed to talk around. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, hat in hand in a way that was not performative but genuinely uncomfortable, and asked if there was any possibility of a temporary grazing arrangement on the Whitmore Creek Bend section for 20 of his remaining cattle, in exchange for labor or future consideration. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked at Cavell. He was a proud man reduced by circumstances to asking for something, and he was doing it as cleanly as he could manage, and she felt no particular satisfaction in witnessing it. What she felt was something more practical, the recognition of an opportunity that was also a responsibility. "We can take 20 head," she said. "No payment required. We'll work out the arrangement in writing so everyone's clear on the terms." Cavell's jaw moved. "I can pay something. When the drought breaks and things settle, we can talk about it then. Right now we have the grass, and you need it." She paused. "That's reason enough." Caleb said nothing during this exchange. Afterward, when Cavell had gone to see Cutter about the logistics, Caleb stood next to her on the porch and looked at the yard. "That's the fourth request this week," he said. "Yes. We can't take cattle from everyone who asks." "No, but we can formalize it." She had been thinking about this for several days. If we structure it as a cooperative arrangement, shared grazing rights, shared water access, recorded agreements, we're not just doing favors, we're building a network. When things recover, that network has value. He looked at her sideways. "You want to build a cattle cooperative. I want to make sure that what we're doing right now doesn't disappear when the drought ends. The ranchers who are depending on us today will remember it. That's either an informal debt or it's the foundation of something more formal. I'd rather it be formal." He was quiet for a moment. "Hale's going to see this as a threat." "Hale already sees us as a threat. That ship has sailed." He almost laughed. It was becoming a more frequent thing, that almost laugh, close enough to the real thing now that sometimes she couldn't tell the difference. "Let me think about it," he said. "I know." 3 days later, Dorothy Hale's buggy appeared in the yard for the first time since the previous autumn. Dorothy was alone this time. No Franklin, no social visit pretense. She climbed down herself, which she hadn't done the last time, and she came to the porch and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing something new. Not the flat contempt of before, something more complicated that Dorothy was not entirely in control of. "Franklin wants to talk," Dorothy said. To Caleb. "About?" "The water claim." A pause. "And other things." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I'll let Caleb know. He'll be in touch through our attorney." Dorothy blinked. "You have an attorney." "We do now." A silence. Dorothy looked at the yard, at the healthy cattle visible through the fence, at the well-maintained property, at the organized activity of a working operation that was not failing. "You've done things here," Dorothy said. It came out differently than anything else she'd ever said at this ranch, not as an observation designed to diminish, but as something closer to a statement of fact reluctantly offered. "We've worked," Evelyn said. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face that was difficult to read and that Dorothy herself seemed uncertain about. Then she turned and got back in the buggy and left the way she'd come. Cutter was at the barn door. He had watched the whole exchange. He said. Evelyn turned. "Don't start." "Didn't say a word," Cutter said, and went back inside. She stood on the porch for another moment, looking at the land that had been handed to her in the form of a practical arrangement, and that had become, over months of early mornings and difficult conversations and careful accumulated decision-making, something she thought of as hers, in a way that had nothing to do with legal ownership and everything to do with the fact that she understood it now. Its rhythms, its failures, its capacity, its specific silences in different seasons. The drought would break. It always did. The question was what remained when it did, and who remained with it, and what the relationships between those people looked like after they'd been through the fire of a common difficulty. She already had a fairly clear idea about those questions. She had been building the answers for most of a year, one careful decision at a time, in a place where no one had expected her to build anything at all. The drought broke in the second week of September with 3 days of steady rain that came in from the northwest and moved across the county like something that had been delayed and knew it. Cutter stood in the yard the first morning and let it fall on him without moving, which was the most expressive thing Evelyn had ever seen him do. Pete laughed out loud at something. The rain, the relief, being 20 years old and alive on a morning when the worst had passed. And even Ruiz, who expressed almost nothing voluntarily, looked up at the sky with a particular quality of attention that was its own kind of gratitude. The Whitmore herd came through with 89 head intact. 3 animals had been lost during the worst weeks. 2 to heat stress, 1 to a secondary infection that the drought conditions had made worse, and Evelyn had recorded each loss in the accounts with the same precision she applied to everything, because losses were part of the ledger too, and pretending otherwise didn't serve anyone. 89 out of 92 was not a perfect number. It was, compared to what had happened around them, a number that felt close to miraculous without being one. The Fraley operation had lost 60 head. The Cavell Ranch had lost 38. Margaret Dunmore had held her cattle through the drought on the Whitmore Creek Bend grazing arrangement and had lost 4, which she reported to Evelyn in person on the first clear morning after the rain, driving her wagon into the yard with the expression of a woman who had survived something and needed to say so to someone who understood what that meant. 4, she said. I know, Evelyn said. I'm sorry for the 4. Before this year? Margaret stopped, started again. I'd have lost most of them, maybe all. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say that would improve on the fact itself. What do you need right now? Evelyn asked instead. Margaret looked at her steadily. To talk about this cooperative arrangement you mentioned. To Caleb, I thought, but... She paused. It's you I should be talking to, isn't it? It's both of us, Evelyn said. Come inside. The meeting that happened in the Whitmore kitchen that morning was not planned and had no formal character to it at all. It was Margaret sitting across the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Evelyn with her notebook open, and Caleb leaning against the counter because he'd come in from the yard and hadn't sat down yet, and somehow never did. But it was the first real conversation about what the cooperative could actually be, and it lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, the shape of something had emerged that was more concrete than anything Evelyn had sketched on paper in the preceding weeks. The idea was straightforward in its bones and complicated in its execution, which was the character of most worthwhile things. The ranches that had participated in the water rights contest, 6 properties, covering a combined acreage that was not insignificant, would formalize their relationship around 3 things: shared grazing access during emergencies, a collective buying arrangement for feed and supplies that would reduce individual costs, and a joint approach to the buyer market that would let them present combined cattle volume to buyers who currently dealt only with large operations like the Hale Ranch. That last piece was the one that made Caleb push off the counter and come to the table. Combined volume, he said. We have maybe 800 head between us right now after the drought losses, Evelyn said. That's not a number Henderson ignores. That's a number that gets you into conversations with buyers in Chicago. Caleb looked at her. Chicago. There are buyers in Chicago who pay 30% above regional rates for documented quality bloodlines. They supply the hotel trade, the restaurant market on the eastern seaboard. They want consistency, and they want documentation. She turned to a page in her notebook. We have the Landry bloodline documentation. If the other operations in the cooperative agree to shift toward compatible breeding programs over the next 2 years, we can present a unified product to that market. Margaret had been listening with the careful attention of someone who understood what was being proposed. That's not a quick return. No, 2 years minimum before it shows in the price we get. But the cooperative buying arrangement reduces costs immediately. That's real money in the next 6 months. Caleb sat down. This, Evelyn had learned, was his version of committing to a conversation. The act of sitting, of making himself part of the table rather than a bystander at its edge. The other ranchers need to agree, he said. Yes, that's the work. Birch will, Fraley probably. Cavell's going to take convincing again. He paused. Dunmore? He was looking at Margaret as he said this, which was a thing Evelyn noticed. He'd started doing that, including people in the room in the conversation rather than speaking about them as if they were elsewhere. She didn't know exactly when that had changed. Dunmore's in, Margaret said. Obviously. The next 3 weeks were the most complex of the entire year, and the year had not been simple. Evelyn and Caleb visited each of the participating ranches with the cooperative proposal written out in full, terms of membership, obligations, decision-making structure, exit provisions. Evelyn had written it over 4 nights at the office desk, long after the ranch had gone to sleep, working from the agricultural cooperative models she'd read about in journals and adapting them to the specific circumstances of frontier cattle ranching in a way that required more original thinking than she'd initially expected. She was not certain it was right. She was certain it was the best she could do with what she knew, and she had built in enough flexibility that it could be adjusted as things revealed themselves. Perfection was not available. Workable was. Birch read the proposal in one sitting and said he'd sign it. Fraley asked 6 questions, all of them good, and accepted the answers and said he'd sign it. Cavell argued about the decision-making structure for an hour and a half, and then said he'd sign it if the voting weight was proportional to head count rather than equal per ranch, which Evelyn had actually anticipated and had prepared a counter-proposal for, that split the difference in a way that gave Cavell enough of what he wanted that he could accept it without feeling he'd lost something. She had anticipated it because she'd thought, sitting at the desk at 2 a.m, about what she would object to if she were Cavell. This was not a skill she'd been taught. It was a habit she'd developed over years of being underestimated. If you were not going to be included in the room where decisions were made, you learned to think about those decisions so thoroughly before they happened that you arrived prepared for outcomes other people hadn't considered. The Prentice's son, Thomas, 26, serious and somewhat overwhelmed by the responsibility of his family's operation, took the longest, not because he was opposed, but because he was frightened of committing to something he didn't fully understand, which was an honest and not unreasonable position. Evelyn sat with him for 3 hours at his kitchen table and answered every question he had, and some he hadn't thought to ask yet, and at the end of it he said, "My father would want me to do this," in the particular way young people said things when they were telling you they had decided. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked. He looked at her, slightly startled, as if the question hadn't occurred to him as a separate one from what his father wanted. He thought about it for a moment with a seriousness she respected. "I want to not lose this land," he said. "Then this is how you keep it," she said. "Not alone." He signed. The cooperative charter was finalized on a Thursday afternoon at the Birch property, which was the largest and most central, with all 6 ranchers present or represented. Evelyn had expected this to feel like something, some formal weight to the moment. What it actually felt like was 6 tired people in a ranch kitchen, some of whom didn't particularly like each other, signing a document that obligated them to something none of them had anticipated a year ago. Birch brought out a bottle that had been in his cabinet for some years and poured a measure for everyone, including, after a brief hesitation, Evelyn, which in this company was a statement of a kind. Cavell, across the table, looked at his glass and then looked at Evelyn and said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "Last winter, when you and Caleb first came around, I said some things to my wife about—" He stopped. "About whether a woman had any business in these conversations." His jaw worked slightly. "I was wrong about that." The room was quiet in the specific way rooms got quiet when something real had been said. "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "I imagine it's a little late." "It's not too late. It's just when it happened." Cavell nodded. He drank his measure and set the glass down and looked at the signed charter on the table, with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive and was still working out exactly how he felt about it. Franklin Hale made his move 12 days later. He called the notes. Not all of them on the same day. That would have been too obvious in its coordination. He staggered them across 2 weeks, starting with the Dunmore note, then the Prentice note, then the Fraley note, and finally the Whitmore note, each delivered by his land attorney's office in a formal letter that cited the terms of the original agreement and requested full payment within 30 days or initiation of foreclosure proceedings. Margaret Dunmore brought her letter to Evelyn before she even brought it home to read again. She arrived in the Whitmore yard at 7 a.m. with the letter in her hand and something in her face that was anger working to hold back fear, because she was a woman who had survived a difficult year and she was not going to let fear lead, but the fear was there. "He waited," Margaret said. "He waited until after the drought, until we'd all used our reserves getting through it, and now he's calling them." "I know," Evelyn said. "Did you expect this?" "I expected something like it. I didn't know the exact timing." She looked at the letter. "Come in." The 4 letters arrived over 9 days. Evelyn had been preparing for this since the summer. Since the conversation in the office when Caleb had laid out Hale's position and she had understood that the water rights contest was only one part of what was coming, she had known the notes would eventually be called. What she had been working on in the hours after the ranch went to sleep was what happened when they were. The answer she had arrived at required something she hadn't had when she arrived in Montana 14 months ago: relationships. What she now had, built from the water rights fight and the drought and the cooperative charter, was something that functioned like a financial argument that a single ranch could not make alone. She called a meeting of the cooperative ranchers the day after the last note letter arrived. They gathered again at the Birch property, which had become the unofficial meeting ground because Birch's kitchen was the largest and because his presence at the head of any gathering lent it a gravity that helped. She laid out the situation in full. All 4 notes called. Total debt across the 4 properties, approximately $2,400. Individual repayment impossible for any of the 4 within 30 days. Foreclosure, if Hale proceeded, would allow him to acquire the properties at distressed valuations, well below their actual worth, and effectively dismantle the cooperative before it had produced its first collective sale. "So he wins," Fraley said. His voice was flat. "Not necessarily," Evelyn said. She opened the second folder she'd brought. "I've been in correspondence with a land bank in Helena over the past 6 weeks. A land bank is an instrument that exists specifically to support agricultural operations. It lends against the value of land and cattle at rates that are structured for long repayment periods rather than short-term commercial terms." She looked around the table. The combined value of the 4 properties under note, assessed at realistic market rates, is approximately $14,000. The debt Hale is calling is $2,400. A land bank loan to retire the notes collectively, secured against the combined cooperative assets, would require a monthly payment that is individually manageable for each operation. The room processed this. Birch, who had been following closely, said, "You'd be replacing one creditor with another. A different kind of creditor. One that exists to keep agricultural land in production, not to acquire it. One that doesn't benefit from foreclosure." She paused. "And one that requires the cooperative structure as a condition of the loan, which formalizes and protects the arrangement we've already built." "Have you talked to this land bank?" Caleb asked. He was looking at her with the full attention that she'd learned to recognize as his version of being genuinely impressed. Not stated, just present, like a light that had been turned on in a room. "I have a meeting in Helena next week. I was going to ask if you'd come with me." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Without the pause he would have taken 8 months ago, the pause that was about calculating what it meant to agree with her. Cavell said, "What if the bank says no?" "Then we look at the next option, but I believe they'll say yes. The numbers support it." She closed the folder. "Hale's plan depends on us being isolated. Individual ranchers with individual debts and no collective leverage. We're not that anymore." The room was quiet. Fraley was looking at the table. Prentice was looking at his hands. Margaret Dunmore was looking at Evelyn with an expression that Evelyn couldn't fully read, but that had something in it that was beyond the practical moment. Something that was about more than the land bank and the notes. "You knew he'd do this," Margaret said quietly. "You knew when you wrote the cooperative charter. You put the provisions in about collective debt defense." "I thought it was possible," Evelyn said. "I wanted us to have the structure already in place when it happened. It's easier to move through an established framework than to build one in a crisis." "You built it while we were still in the crisis," Birch said. "You built it with us," she said. "That's the thing that makes it work." The meeting in Helena happened on a Tuesday, 4 days before the first of Hale's note deadlines. Evelyn and Caleb took the train, which Evelyn had not been on since arriving in Montana 14 months ago, and the particular quality of sitting in a passenger car watching landscape move past her was different now than it had been then. She was not arriving at an unknown thing, but leaving a known one temporarily, and the land outside the window was not foreign, but recognizable. Hers in the particular way things become yours through the daily work of tending them. Caleb was quiet for the first hour of the journey, which was not unusual. Then he said, The first time I saw you at the station in Billings, I thought I'd made a mistake. She looked at him. I know. You knew that. Your face wasn't difficult to read. He exhaled. It was almost a laugh. No, I suppose not. He was looking at the window, at the moving land. I want to say something, and I'm not practiced at this kind of thing. I know that too, she said. Then you probably know what I'm trying to say. I have a reasonable idea, but I think you should say it anyway. He turned from the window and looked at her directly with the look that had been evolving since January, since the Creek walkthrough, since the Henderson negotiation, since every morning when the decisions that she made turned out to be right and the world slowly adjusted its assessment of what she was. It was not a polished look. It was a look that still had difficulty in it, the difficulty of a man who had been wrong about something important and was learning to hold that alongside everything else. I think you're the most capable person I've ever known, he said. And I spent the first month trying to keep you out of the parts of this place that mattered. I spent the first month waiting for you to fail so I could... He stopped. So you could confirm what you'd already decided, she said. Yes. The word was flat, honest, without excuse. And instead? Instead you did everything but fail. He paused. And I still dragged my feet. On the Henderson contract, on the breeding program, on the cooperative. He looked at his hands. Every time. You'd done the work and I'd make you wait while I caught up. She looked at him carefully. She thought about what she wanted to say and whether the moment called for the full truth or a partial one, and she decided the full truth was what this conversation required. You also went to Billings and held the line on the Henderson terms when you didn't have to. You rode out to Birch with me when it would have been easier not to. You sat across from Thomas Prentice and let me run that conversation without making it about who was running it. She paused. That's not a man dragging his feet. That's a man learning. Those aren't the same thing. He was looking at her with something that was past the usual categories. Not the recalibration expression, not the complicated look, but something simpler and harder to sustain. The look of a person who has stopped managing their response to another person and is simply present with them. Evelyn, he said. Yes. I'm glad you got on that train. In Columbus. I'm glad you came. It was not an eloquent declaration. It was not designed to be. It had the quality of something said because it needed to be said, rather than because the moment had been prepared for, and she valued that more than any arranged sentiment would have been. So am I, she said. Most of the time. He looked at her sharply, and she let him see the small private curve at the corner of her mouth that meant she was not being entirely serious, and something in his face opened in a way she hadn't seen before. A genuine warmth, unguarded. The look of a man who had just discovered his wife had a sense of humor that he hadn't known about, and was not sure what to do with how much he liked it. Most of the time, he repeated. The pump situation was a difficult week, she said. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the almost laugh, not the compression of it, but the real thing, sudden and unself-conscious. And it changed his face completely. And she thought, there it is. That's who he actually is under all the rest of it. The land bank meeting lasted 3 hours. The officer they met was a methodical man named Gerald Voss, who had the particular combination of skepticism and open-mindedness that characterized people who were good at evaluating proposals on their merits rather than their presentation. He read the documentation Evelyn had prepared. He asked questions that were penetrating and sometimes uncomfortable, and that she answered without softening. At one point he asked directly who had prepared the financial analysis. I did, Evelyn said. Voss looked at her over his papers. You have banking experience? No, I have accounting experience and I read carefully. He made a note. She couldn't see what it said. The loan was approved in principle at the end of the meeting, subject to property appraisals and final documentation, with a repayment structure that extended across 7 years at terms that were workable for all 4 properties. Voss shook hands with Caleb and then, with a slight deliberateness that was its own kind of statement, shook hands with Evelyn. The cooperative structure is sound, he said. We don't often see this level of preparation from operations of this size. Thank you, Evelyn said. On the train back to Billings that evening, Caleb told her about the handshake. "He shook your hand first," he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was more like a man noting a fact that was also, to him, a form of recognition delivered on her behalf by someone neutral. "He shook yours too," she said. "Yes, but—" He stopped, looked at the window. "You should have been the one presenting, at the table, not standing behind me." "I wasn't standing behind you. I was sitting next to you. You know what I mean." She did. And she appreciated that he'd said it because it cost him something. Not the apology kind of cost, but the more complicated cost of acknowledging a pattern that had been in place and deciding it should change. "We'll adjust," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will." The Hale notes were retired through the land bank loan in the last week of October. Hale's attorney received the payments in full, each one on time, each one accompanied by a release of lien documentation that Evelyn had prepared herself after reviewing what the bank's attorney provided and finding 2 clauses she wanted clarified before signing. Hale's attorney had come back with the clarifications without comment, which told her something about how the calculation had shifted. Hale himself said nothing publicly. Men like Franklin Hale did not issue statements about their failed maneuvers. They reassessed and repositioned and waited for the next opening. And Evelyn understood this, and she was not under the illusion that the water rights settlement or the note retirements constituted a permanent peace. They constituted a changed circumstance, and changed circumstances required ongoing maintenance. The water rights case was settled in November by a county judge who ruled in favor of the shared use arrangement on the basis of prior use documentation, explicitly citing the survey notation Evelyn had found in the Whitmore files and the witness bill of sale from Margaret Dunmore's records. Hale's claim was denied. The tributary remained shared. Agnes Holt, the county clerk, sent a copy of the ruling to the Whitmore Ranch with a handwritten note at the bottom that said simply, "Well organized." Evelyn put it in the desk drawer with the other things she kept there. The original ledger pages from her first night in the office, Cutter's notes from the Landry Bull inquiry, the first version of the cooperative charter in her own handwriting with all its corrections and second thoughts visible. Ruiz came to her on the first cold morning of November. He came to find her specifically, came to the office doorway and knocked, which he had never done before, always having found reasons to communicate through Caleb or Cutter or simply through actions that made conversation unnecessary. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He was not comfortable with what he was about to say. She could see that in the specific way he held himself, the slight stiffness of a man doing something that required an effort he didn't usually make. "I thought the breeding program was a mistake," he said. "I know you did." "I said so to Caleb." "I know that too." He nodded. "I was wrong." He looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. "The bull's good. The first calves from him they're better than anything we've had on this property. I looked at them this morning." She set down her pencil. "So did I." "You saw them?" "Before breakfast." He almost smiled. "Of course you did." He put his hat back on. "I wanted to say it directly, not around it." "I appreciate that, Ruiz." He nodded again and turned to go. "Ruiz," she said. He stopped. "Your instinct to protect what the ranch had was right. It just needed to be aimed at the right thing." She paused. "The property's better for having people in it who push back." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things she couldn't entirely read. Then he nodded once and left. Cutter found her that afternoon by the creek bend fence and walked the section with her the way he had on that first Tuesday. The same route, roughly the same pace. The grass was going dormant now for winter, but the ground beneath it had a different quality than it had the previous spring. The root systems were stronger. You could see it in the color and the density, even in the late-season dieback. "Good year," Cutter said. She looked at him. "That's generous." "Lost 3 head, fought off a water claim, got a bank loan, built a cooperative." He paused. "Started a breeding program that's going to change what this herd looks like in 2 years." Another pause. "Good year." She looked out at the creek. It was running clear and steady. The autumn rain had recharged it, and Hale's claim was gone, and the water would be there next summer and the summer after that. Cutter, she said. When I first came here, when you walked this section with me that first afternoon, what did you think? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to questions that deserved it. I thought you saw things other people weren't seeing. I didn't know what you were going to do with it. And now? Now I know what you do with it. He looked at the creek. You build something. They stood there for a while in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over a year of working alongside each other in the particular way that work, done honestly and consistently, builds its own kind of language between people who might not otherwise have had much to say. Then Cutter said, Second Landry bull arrives Thursday. I know. I arranged it. Just making sure you knew. I always know, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. That's what I find I keep having to remember. That evening, Caleb came in from the yard at dusk and found her in the kitchen where she'd started a pot of something that would be ready in an hour. And he stopped in the doorway the way he had on that first evening more than a year ago, but the quality of the stop was entirely different now. He was not calculating what she was. He was just looking at her, the way you looked at someone whose presence in a room had become part of how the room felt to you. Good day, he said. Productive, she said. You? Cutter thinks the east fence needs resetting in the spring. He's right. I noticed the post spacing on the north section is off. Of course you did. She looked at him. He was smiling. A real one, not the compressed almost version, the actual thing. She'd been seeing it more often in recent weeks and had found, each time, that it changed the whole register of the room. I was thinking, he said, coming to the table and sitting down, about the spring cattle sale, the first one under the cooperative structure. What about it? I think you should take the lead on the buyer negotiations. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He met her look without flinching. Not because I can't do it, he said. Because you do it better, and we both know it, and I'm done pretending otherwise in rooms where it costs us to pretend. She turned back to the stove, stirred the pot, let the moment settle. All right, she said. Just like that? You made a sensible proposal. I agreed with it. She glanced back at him. Did you expect me to make it complicated? I wasn't sure. Caleb, she said. Yes. We're past complicated. He was quiet, then, yes, I think we are. Outside, the Montana dark came down the way it always had, all at once, the whole weight of the sky. But the house was lit and warm and full of the particular settled quality of a place that has found its arrangement. Not perfect, nothing ever was, but honest and workable and genuinely inhabited by people who had earned their understanding of each other through the slow, difficult, irreplaceable work of being present to the same life for long enough that it had stopped being something they were navigating and started being something they shared. The first cooperative cattle sale happened in March, 8 months after the drought had broken, and 5 months after the land bank loan had retired the notes that Franklin Hale had called in his last serious attempt to dismantle what was being built in this corner of Montana. It was not a dramatic event. There was no ceremony, no gathered crowd, no particular mourning that announced itself as significant. It was Evelyn, at the desk in the Whitmore office at 5 in the morning with the buyer correspondence laid out in front of her and a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow, going over the combined headcount figures one more time before the train to Billings, because she was not a person who went into a room without having read everything available about what was in it. The combined offering from the 6 cooperative ranches was 843 head, less than what the combined operations would have produced in a good year before the drought, but representing in terms of documented bloodline quality, something that none of them had been able to present individually before. Evelyn had spent 3 months building the buyer documentation, provenance records for every animal traceable to the Landry bloodline, weight and condition logs, grazing and feeding records detailed enough that a buyer in Chicago could reconstruct the history of each animal on paper before deciding whether to bid. This level of documentation was not standard practice in regional cattle sales. It was in fact sufficiently unusual that when Evelyn had written to the Chicago buyers whose names she'd obtained through 2 layers of correspondence, a contact in Helena who knew a railroad purchasing agent who knew the name of the firm, the initial response had been skeptical. Not dismissive, But the careful skepticism of buyers who had been oversold by regional operations before and had learned to hold a certain reserve. She had written back with the documentation itself, 40 pages of it, and had asked for nothing except the opportunity to meet. They had agreed to meet. Caleb came with her to Billings. He came in the capacity she had described in November, not as the lead, not as the face of the operation in the old sense, but as a partner in the specific meaning of that word, someone who carried half the weight and knew what the other person was carrying. He had spent 2 weeks learning the bloodline documentation cold so that any question a buyer asked him he could answer accurately, because Evelyn had told him in the plainest terms that there was nothing more damaging in a buyer meeting than having someone in the room who couldn't answer a question about what they were selling. He had studied. He had asked her to quiz him on it 3 times, the last time 2 nights before they left, sitting at the kitchen table after the house had gone quiet, and she had asked him increasingly specific questions, and he had answered most of them correctly and had said, "I don't know," when he didn't, which she had told him was the right answer every time. "Why is 'I don't know' the right answer?" he'd asked. "Because the wrong answer costs you credibility on everything else you say. 'I don't know, but I'll find out' keeps it." He had nodded. She could see him filing this, not as a technique, but as a principle, the kind of thing that reorganized how you moved through situations. The buyer meeting in Billings was with 2 men from a firm called Alderton and Morse, which supplied premium beef to hotels and restaurants in Chicago and New York. The men were named Bernard Alderton, who was 50-ish, and had the specific manner of someone who had made a great deal of money being correct about quality assessments, and a younger man named Farrow, who took notes and asked the technical questions. Evelyn had not told them she was the person who had prepared the documentation. She had introduced herself as Evelyn Whitmore, member of the Montana Cattle Cooperative, and let the documentation speak for what it was before anyone in the room formed an opinion about who had made it. Alderton read through the summary pages with the focused silence of a man conducting a real evaluation. Farrow asked about the Landry bloodline provenance, and Caleb answered from memory, accurately, including the specific genetic characteristics that distinguished it, and Farrow wrote things down. Then Alderton looked up and said, "Who compiled this documentation?" "I did," Evelyn said. Alderton looked at her for a moment. Not the Dorothy Hale look, not that flat dismissive appraisal. Something more neutral and more careful, the look of a man recalibrating in real time against evidence rather than expectation. "You have a background in animal husbandry?" "In accounting and agricultural management, I read extensively." "Evidently." He turned a page. "The water management records here. This is more detailed than what we receive from operations 10 times your size." "The water situation in our county has made water management a priority," she said, which was accurate and said everything it needed to without telling him the full story of Franklin Hale, because some context added value to a conversation and some context was simply noise. Alderton almost smiled. "How much of the 843 head can you deliver by June?" She had prepared 3 delivery scenarios. She gave him the one that was realistic rather than the one that was optimistic, because she was not going to start a new buyer relationship by promising something she hadn't fully confirmed with every cooperative member. They negotiated for 2 hours. It was not a smooth negotiation. Alderton pushed on price, on delivery terms, on the percentage of documented bloodline animals versus mixed stock. Evelyn held some lines and moved on others with a precision that Caleb, watching from his position at the table, later described as watching someone play chess with a person who had expected to be playing checkers. The contract they left Billings with was not everything she'd hoped for. It was a first contract, smaller volume than the full cooperative offering, with a price premium that was real, but not the maximum she'd projected in the best-case scenario. It was, however, a contract with Alderton and Morse, whose name in the Chicago market was a reference that would open the next door. And it contained a clause, which she had proposed and Alderton had accepted after brief consideration, that gave the cooperative right of first offer on expanded volume in the following year if the first delivery met quality specifications. That clause was the thing she cared most about in the entire document. On the train back from Billings, Caleb was quiet for a while in the way that meant he was processing rather than withdrawing. Then he said, "The price they came back with on the mixed stock. You didn't fight that hard for it." "No," You could have. I could have gotten another 4 or 5% on the mixed stock and damaged the relationship on the documented bloodline discussion, where the real money is in year 2. She looked at the passing land. You give something on what matters less. You hold on what matters more. He was quiet again. Then, how do you know which is which? You know what you're actually building, not what you're selling today. What you're building. She paused. We're building a reputation with a buyer who can take our full volume in 2 years if the first delivery is right. That's worth more than the 4%. He nodded slowly. Outside, the winterland moved past, brown and flat and vast, the kind of country that looked like nothing from a distance and revealed its complexity only to people who had spent time in it. We did well today, he said. We did all right, she said. We'll do better next time. He looked at her. The small curve at the corner of her mouth was there, the private one, and he had come to know it well enough by now that he simply smiled back and looked out the window. The cooperative's first Alderton and Morse delivery happened in June, 2 days ahead of schedule, because Evelyn had built a 2-day buffer into the logistics, and Ruiz, who had taken on the transport coordination with the focused competence of a man who had finally found a task that fully engaged him, had run the loading operation with a precision that had even Cutter nodding in approval. The cattle arrived in Chicago in the condition they had left Montana. The documentation matched the animals matched the documentation, and the weights were within 2% of specification. Bernard Alderton sent a letter. It was a short letter, businesslike, confirming receipt and quality and initiating the payment process. The last line said, "We look forward to discussing year 2 terms at your earliest convenience." Evelyn read this letter at the office desk on a Thursday morning and then set it down and sat with it for a moment, alone in the room before anyone else in the house was up. Outside, the June light was coming in at the low morning angle that made the yard look different than it did at any other time of day. Softer, more particular, the individual character of each fence post and building visible in the long shadows. She thought about a train station in Columbus, a trunk with a damaged corner, a courtroom that smelled like pipe tobacco. She thought about standing in a yard with Dorothy Hale's contempt landing on her like something physical while the man she'd married said nothing. She thought about the south pasture on that first walkthrough, the cracked water trough, the gate wired shut on one hinge. She thought about the ledgers she'd spread out on this desk on her first night here and the picture they'd made. Not hopeless, never hopeless, but requiring a kind of attention that hadn't been given to them. She was not given to sentiment in the easy sense, but she was honest about what things had cost, and the distance between that first night and this morning had a cost attached to it that she could feel clearly, not as pride, that pride was too simple, but as something more like the quiet, verifiable satisfaction of having been right about what was possible when most of the people around you were certain you were wrong. She picked up her pencil and started working on the year 2 proposal. The cooperative grew in its second year in ways that the founding members had not fully anticipated, which was how good structures worked. They created conditions that attracted things you hadn't planned for. Emmett Fraley's cousin, a younger man named Will, who had been farming grain to the south and had been watching the cooperative's first year from a distance, came to Evelyn in August of that second year with a proposal to join. He raised a different category of cattle, a breed suited to different market conditions. And the initial question was whether the cooperative structure could accommodate a member whose product didn't directly align with the Alderton and Morse contract. Evelyn spent 2 weeks thinking about this and came to the meeting with Fraley's cousin, having already drafted 3 possible membership structures that addressed the accommodation question. The one they settled on created a tiered system, a core membership with the premium documented bloodline program, and an associate membership for operations with compatible but distinct product lines that could access the cooperative's collective buying power and water rights protections without the full Alderton contract obligation. It was not the model she had originally built. She adjusted the model. This was not a capitulation to something she hadn't planned for. It was the recognition that a useful structure evolved when the people inside it understood what the structure was actually for and made it serve that purpose, rather than preserving the form at the expense of the function. Will Fraley joined as an associate member. By the following spring, 2 other operations had joined on the same terms. Pete left the Whitmore Ranch in the second autumn to start his own operation. A small one, 40 acres he'd saved for over 3 years, to the east of the county. He came to Evelyn before he told Caleb, which she noted without making much of it, and he was nervous in the way of someone announcing something they were proud of to a person whose opinion mattered to them. "I wanted to tell you first," he said. "I'm glad you did," she said. "40 acres is a beginning." "You started somewhere too," he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself for having said it. "I did," she said. "Although technically I married into the starting point." "You built it," he said. "The starting point was different than what it became." She looked at him. 22 now, grown considerably from the young man who had knocked over the coffee pot in the kitchen and frozen. He had learned a great deal in 2 years, and some of it he had learned from her deliberately, and some of it he had learned simply from being in a place where the thinking that governed decisions was visible if you paid attention. "Join the cooperative as an associate member when you're ready," she said. "You'll have access to the collective buying rates and the water rights framework." His face did something complicated and genuine. "I was hoping you'd say that." "I know. That's why I said it before you had to ask." He laughed. Then he went to find Caleb and tell him, and Evelyn heard them talking in the yard for a long time afterward, Caleb's voice measured and Ruiz's drifting over from the barn at one point. Everyone who had watched Pete become what he was saying goodbye to the part of it they'd been part of. She didn't go out. She let them have it. Franklin Hale made one more move. It came in the 3rd year, and it came in a form she hadn't fully anticipated, which was instructive. She had thought, by then, that she had learned to account for most of what he was capable of, and the fact that she hadn't accounted for this one reminded her that complacency was the thing that came for you when you'd been right often enough to start assuming you always would be. He didn't come at the land or the water this time. He came at the market. He had, in the preceding year, been developing his own relationship with a buyer in St. Louis, a different firm from Alderton and Morse, but one that operated in overlapping markets. What he had done quietly was begin circulating information about the cooperative's cattle through that St. Louis firm in a way that was designed to create doubt. Not lies exactly. Hale was too careful for direct fabrication. But the selective presentation of information in ways that implied quality and consistency, that raised questions about the documentation, that suggested the cooperative's rapid growth was a sign of corner-cutting rather than genuine capability. Evelyn found out about this because Margaret Dunmore's nephew worked as a clerk for a Billings freight company that handled shipments for both the Hale operation and the St. Louis firm, and he had, in the course of his work, seen correspondence that Margaret had seen fit to share. She read the information Margaret brought her and sat with it for 24 hours before saying anything to anyone, because her first response to it was anger of a genuine and focused kind, and she had learned that anger was a useful fuel only after you'd decided what it was going to power. What she decided, after 24 hours, was that the most effective response was not a defensive one. Defending against questions about quality meant staying in a conversation that Hale had chosen the terms of. What she wanted was a different conversation, on terms she chose, with a larger audience. She wrote to Alderton and Morse and proposed that the cooperative host a site visit for their buyers in the coming spring, an invitation for Bernard Alderton and whomever he chose to bring to come to Montana and see the operation themselves. Not a tour for its own sake, but a documented assessment. The buyers would walk the properties, inspect the cattle, review the management records in person, and produce their own written evaluation. Alderton replied within a week. He would come in April. He would bring Farrow and one additional assessor. She then wrote letters to each of the cooperative members laying out what the site visit meant and what it required. Every property in its best working condition, every record current and organized, every question an outside assessor might ask answered in advance by someone at each ranch who had read and understood their own documentation. She gave them 6 weeks to prepare, and she told them plainly, in the letter, that what Hale had done was attempt to substitute rumor for evidence. And the only effective counter to that was evidence so thorough and accessible that rumor had nowhere to gain purchase. Birch, reading the letter, sent a reply that said, "We're ready. We've been ready since you got here." She kept that letter. She put it with the Agnes Holt note in the desk drawer. The April site visit lasted 4 days. Alderton and his assessors visited all 6 core cooperative properties, reviewed documentation, examined the cattle, talked to the ranch hands, walked the grazing sections. Farrow was thorough in the specific way of someone trained to find discrepancies, and Evelyn did not manage him or soften anything or redirect his attention away from anything. She showed him everything and answered every question and let the properties speak for what they actually were. On the last day, Alderton stood in the Whitmore yard and looked at the herd that had come so far in 3 years from the mixed unremarkable lot of the original Whitmore stock, and he said, "The documentation understated the quality." "We're conservative in what we put on paper," Evelyn said. "We'd rather deliver more than we promised than less." He looked at her. "That's not common." "It should be." Alderton published his assessment through his firm's buyer network. It was not a testimonial. It was a quality report, the kind of document that circulated in the professional buyer community as factual record. It described the cooperative's operations, management practices, and cattle quality in the precise, unemotional language of someone reporting what they had observed. It was one of the most effective things that had ever been written on behalf of what Evelyn had built, and she had not written a word of it. She had simply made it true. The St. Louis Doubt campaign stopped, not because Hale withdrew it. She doubted he formally withdrew anything, but because doubt required a vacuum to fill, and Alderton's report filled it with something else entirely. Caleb heard about the report from Birch, who had received a copy from Alderton directly. He came home with it and put it on the office desk and stood there while Evelyn read it. She read it twice. She set it down. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed and an expression that was not quite describable, somewhere between satisfaction and something that went deeper than satisfaction, the look of a man who had watched something he'd almost prevented come to full existence and understood the full weight of both parts of that. "I'm sorry I made you prove it this many times," he said. "You didn't make me prove it," she said. "The situation made me prove it. You just got out of the way eventually." He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze and held it steadily enough that he saw she meant it, not unkindly, but accurately. "That's fair," he said. And then after a moment, "Is eventually enough?" "Eventually is when it happened," she said. "So yes, it was enough." He was quiet. He looked at the report on the desk. "Our son is going to grow up knowing his mother built this," he said. The word, son, landed in the room with a different weight than anything else that had been said, because Evelyn was 4 months along, which was not a thing they had discussed with anyone outside the household, and which Caleb mentioned here not as news but as a fact he was sitting with. The particular convergence of the business report on the desk and the changed future it represented, and the person who would inherit what was being built. She looked at him. "Or daughter," she said. "Or daughter," he agreed. "She'll know her mother had help," Evelyn said. "That's important too. None of this was alone." He nodded. He understood that. She had watched him come to understand it, not quickly, not easily, but genuinely, in the way that understanding that costs you something is more durable than understanding that comes for free. Dorothy Hale appeared at the Whitmore Ranch one last time in the 4th year, and this time she came alone and she came without the buggy. She rode herself, which Evelyn had not seen her do before, and she tied her horse to the yard post and came to the porch door and knocked. Evelyn opened it. Dorothy was 54 and looked it in a way she hadn't when she'd first appeared in this yard. Not aged badly, but honestly, the face of a woman who had been through some years that had not been kind in the way she'd expected her years to be kind. "Franklin is selling," Dorothy said. "The north section, about 800 acres. Evelyn waited. He's not well. His heart." Dorothy said this plainly, the way someone said something they had been living with long enough that the sharp edge of it had worn down to something that was just true. "He's not going to be able to manage the full operation." "I'm sorry to hear that," Evelyn said. Dorothy looked at her. "Are you?" A pause. "I'm sorry he's unwell. That's separate from everything else." Dorothy nodded. This seemed to be the answer she'd expected, or close to it. "I wanted to ask, before he lists it publicly, whether the cooperative would have interest in the north section." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. 800 acres of Hale land,
the north section, which bordered two of the cooperative's member properties and contained within its boundaries the eastern reach of the tributary that had been the subject of the water rights contest 4 years ago. "Sit down," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." Dorothy hesitated. Then she came inside and sat at the kitchen table, which she had never done in 4 years of knowing the Whitmores. And Evelyn made coffee, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen where so much of the preceding years had happened. The breakfast arguments, the late-night accounts, the conversations with Cutter and Pete and Margaret Dunmore and all the rest. And they talked for 2 hours. Not as friends. They were not going to be friends. There was too much in the history for that, and neither of them was the kind of woman who pretended about such things. But as two people with intersecting practical interests who were capable, if they chose, of a conversation that served both.
The cooperative acquired 400 acres of the north section, not the full 800, which was more than the available capital could responsibly absorb, at a price that was fair in the sense that it was supported by current land valuations, not the distressed sale price that Hale had once tried to impose on others. Dorothy negotiated on Franklin's behalf with a directness that Evelyn found, despite herself, worth respecting. She pushed hard on 2 terms and let the others go, which was the right way to negotiate, and they reached an agreement without requiring attorneys for the final shape of it. The land that the cooperative acquired included the eastern reach of the tributary. The water rights question, which had haunted 4 years of this county's ranching history, was resolved in the simplest possible way. The land that contained the source came into collective ownership, and the question of who had rights to it became, in the practical sense that mattered, a question about what the cooperative decided to do with what it owned. Evelyn recorded this in the accounts with the same precision she applied to everything. The entry looked like any other entry: date, amount, description, source. She wrote it in her small, even handwriting and set the pen down and looked at it for a moment, and what she felt was not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what this was. What this was completion. The end of a thread that had been running through 4 years of work, tied off at last in a way that she could look at and call finished. The Whitmore Ranch in its 5th year bore a different relationship to the county around it than it had borne on the morning Evelyn had arrived with a damaged trunk and a practical arrangement, and no particular expectation of anything beyond a life that was useful and not dishonest. It was not the largest operation in the region. It would not become the largest. That was not what it was built for. But it was the center of a cooperative network that now comprised 11 member ranches across 2 counties, that had a documented supply relationship with Alderton and Morse, and 2 additional buyers whose names had come through that original relationship the way first relationships, done well, always generated the next ones. It had a water management framework that other counties were beginning to study, because the drought of 4 years past had not been unique to this region, and people elsewhere were looking for models that had survived it. People came to ask Evelyn questions. This had begun, tentatively, in the 3rd year and had become by the 5th year a steady enough occurrence that she had organized it. A quarterly gathering at the Birch property where other ranchers and farmers, some from as far as 2 counties away, could come to talk through the cooperative model, ask questions, and take away the documentation she'd prepared for each gathering in her careful handwriting. She did not call these gatherings educational or formal. She called them meetings, because what they were was people with practical problems talking to other people who had solved practical problems, and ceremony around that only got in the way. Cutter came to the first 3 and then stopped coming, which she had expected. He attended things until he'd extracted what was useful from them and then went back to work, which was his way and which was entirely correct. Ruiz had, by the 4th year, become the cooperative's de facto logistics coordinator, the person who managed the transport and delivery side of the Alderton and Morse contract, and whose competence in that domain had become the kind of competence that people recognized from the outside without needing to be told about it. Alderton's firm had once sent a letter addressed to R. Ruiz Logistics, and Ruiz had shown it to nobody, but Cutter had seen it on the office desk and mentioned it to Evelyn in passing, and she had filed this away and done nothing with it except carry the satisfaction of it quietly. She had thought, in those first weeks at the Whitmore Ranch, that the hardest thing was going to be the work. The physical work, the learning, the accumulation of knowledge about land and cattle and water and markets that she hadn't been born into and had to acquire in real time from reading and observation and the kind of conversation you had to earn the right to. She had been wrong about that. The hardest thing was the sustained presence it required, the refusal to be absent from the difficulty, day after day, in a place where absence would have been so easy and so understandable, and where no one, in the beginning, would have blamed her for it. She had been underestimated by people who mistook her size for her capacity, her quietness for passivity, her unfamiliarity with the land for ignorance about the world. She had not spent much energy being angry about this, not because the anger wasn't legitimate, it was, but because anger in that particular form, the anger of wanting people to see you differently, was an energy drain that served the people doing the underestimating more than it served you. What served you was doing the work until the evidence was too heavy to argue with. That was not a comfortable philosophy. It required you to hold a long position in situations where you deserved better than you were getting, and to keep working while you held it, and to trust that the evidence would accumulate if you kept making good decisions in a disciplined way. It was not fair. The world did not reorganize itself around fairness on request. It reorganized around demonstrated reality, slowly, imperfectly, with a lag that was sometimes infuriating. But it reorganized. That was the thing she had believed without being able to prove it when she'd stepped off the train in Billings, and that she could point to now with the specificity of documented evidence. On a September morning in the 5th year, she was at the desk before dawn, the way she always was, and Caleb came downstairs and found her there. And he did not ask what she was working on because he already knew. She was always working on something at this hour, and he had long since stopped treating this as a thing that required explanation. He made coffee and brought her a cup and sat down in the chair across the desk, which he did sometimes in the early mornings when he wasn't yet ready to go out and she wasn't ready to stop, and they occupied the same room the way people did when they had become genuinely comfortable with each other's presence. Not performing it, just doing it. The Prentice boy wants to expand, Caleb said. He was asking about the associate membership tier and whether it could convert to full membership. It can. I built that into the original structure. She turned a page. He should come to the October meeting. I'll tell him. He drank his coffee. She worked. Outside, the September dark was beginning to soften at the edges. The particular pre-dawn softening that she had come to know well in 5 years of early mornings on this land. The way the darkness became a different quality of dark before it became light. She's going to ask questions today, Caleb said. This was about their daughter, who was 2.5 and had recently entered a phase of inquiry that was both exhausting and, to Evelyn, privately thrilling in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Yesterday, she wanted to know why the cattle don't come inside the house. What did you tell her? I said they were too big. She'll have a follow-up question about why they can't be smaller. She did. I didn't have a good answer for that one. Evelyn set down her pen. She looked at him. Her husband, this complicated and imperfect and gradually revealed man who had looked at her at a train station with that first recalibrating expression, and had spent 5 years becoming someone different than the person capable of that look. He was not an easy person. He still held things too long before saying them, still had weeks when the compressed quality returned to his jaw and his voice, and the distance between them widened enough that she had to decide whether to bridge it or wait, and she didn't always choose correctly. Neither did he. That was the truth of it. Not a polished truth, not a made-for-telling truth, but the actual one. They had built something together that neither of them could have built alone. This was not a romantic statement. It was a structural one, as verifiable as the accounts in the desk. He had brought the land, the history, the relationships with neighbors built across generations, the name that carried weight in this county even when the operation behind it was failing. She had brought the thinking, the preparation, the willingness to name what was wrong before it got worse, the ability to see patterns in numbers and in people and in land that came from having been her entire life someone who had to understand systems from the outside before she could work within them. Neither contribution was greater. They were different in kind, and together they produced something that was more than either component, which was, if you thought about it, what a cooperative was, what a partnership was, what any useful combination of different things was when it worked. She thought about what she would tell her daughter someday about this. Not the story exactly. The story was available, It would be visible in the land and the records and the name the cooperative operated under and the people who had worked it. What she would want to tell her was something that sat underneath the story, the thing the story was evidence of. Something like, the people who tell you what you're incapable of are telling you something about themselves, not about you. Something like, the best work you will ever do will be the work that required you to stay in a room where you were unwelcome long enough to change what the room was. Something like, competence is quiet and it is patient, and it does not need to be announced because it announces itself eventually through the weight of what it produces. And the only thing that destroys it is walking away before it gets the chance. None of this was simple. She would not oversimplify it for her daughter, who deserved, from the beginning, to understand that the world was complicated and that the work of finding your place in it was real work, not a matter of waiting to be recognized. Cutter appeared in the yard below the office window at the exact moment the sky went from dark to light. His timing was so consistent that Evelyn had come to use it as a kind of clock, the moment Cutter started his day being also the moment the day officially started. He walked to the barn door with his slightly uneven stride, the bad knee still there after all these years, the ground still navigated with the same efficient competence. She watched him for a moment. He had never said he was glad she'd come. He had never offered that in those words. But he had said, on the afternoon of the creek walk in that first week, that the creek bend grass was good. And he had stood in this yard and let the drought rain fall on him, and he had shown her the Landry bull with that expression that was as close to reverence as he got, and he had said, at the end of a hard year, good year. For Cutter, all of that together was a declaration. She understood that now. She had learned to read the language. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The land outside the window was the same land it had been on the morning she'd arrived with her damaged trunk and her practical expectations, and the particular steadiness of a woman who had looked at a difficult situation and decided to stay. The grass was different, better managed, more resilient, rested in the sections that had needed resting and grazed in the sections that could carry the weight. The cattle were different, documented, purposeful, worth considerably more per head than what the original herd had been worth, and worth more still in 2 more years when the full second generation of the breeding program came through. The house was the same house. The desk was the same desk. The light came through the same east window at the same low morning angle. But the room had changed, not in its materials, not in its dimensions, in what it contained, in who was in it, in what the papers on the desk meant, and the name on the accounts, and the sound of a child's voice from upstairs asking, already, before the day had even fully started, why? Why the cattle were outside, why the grass was better by the creek, why some things lasted and some things didn't. Good questions. The best questions were always the ones that looked simple and weren't. Evelyn had been answering them for 5 years, and she had a long time left to go.